Welcome to a world where ancient voices still whisper through the winds. Step into the timeless stories of native tribes, filled with sacred rituals, powerful legends, and deep-rooted wisdom. Grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and prepare to walk the path of spirit, strength, and mystery. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Your roots matter here. If these stories move you, give this video a like and subscribe for more sacred gems. The drums, our calling. Let the journey begin.
What happens when a tribe is told they no longer exist by their own government? The Nooksack of Washington State once thrived in forested valleys and riverbanks, carving cedar canoes and praying to spirit animals. But in the 2000s, they became the epicenter of a brutal modern-day tribal purge. Hundreds disenrolled, evicted, erased. This is the story of how a people fought time, politics, and even each other. To stay seen, the first thing you notice isn't the river or the forest. It's the mist. It rolls low over the earth like memory, soft, silver, and endless. It blurs the line between sky and soil, and in that blur, the Nooksack people found identity. Not written, not shouted, but carved carefully, quietly, from cedar and mist. Cedar was never just wood. It was breath, spirit, a silent relative that gave more than it took. For the Nooksack, it offered shelter, travel, and tools. But deeper still, it offered shape to the sacred. Canoes, masks, totems, all born from its heart. The first canoes were miracles in motion, hollowed by fire, shaped by hand, blessed by elders. Some could hold 10 people, some just one, but all carried more than passengers. They carried names, hopes, dreams. The Nooksack believed the river would not carry you safely unless the tree agreed. So, before a canoe was carved, the tree was spoken to, prayers were whispered, a promise was made. That promise echoed into everything. From the same cedar came the longhouses tall, quiet homes with roofs like folded arms. They didn't tower, they settled, as if resting on the earth instead of ruling it. Inside, families lived in rhythm with firelight and silence. Words didn't need volume here, they needed meaning. In every room, elders taught without teaching, weaving story into daily chores, hiding lessons in laughter, love in discipline. Each plank held more than warmth. It held wisdom, and the mist watched. Totem poles rose not as decorations, but as declarations, carved from cedar that had been blessed and cleaned. They told stories the Nooksack did not write in books. Instead, they wrote with bear claws, eagle, wings, salmon mouths. Each symbol was part of a sentence, each figure a phrase. Some poles warned, others remembered. All spoke to outsiders. They were art. To the Nooksack, they were history standing up. Masks followed, carved faces painted, in red, black, and white. They were not costumes, they were conduits. When worn in ceremony, they blurred the line between human and animal, present and past, dream and waking. The dance that followed was not performance, it was return. With every step, a memory returned. With every drumbeat, a spirit awakened. Even the children, we do not play with the mask. We honor it, but no mask is more sacred than the voice. Worn in the days after death, it did not hide grief. It calmed it. It showed the weight of absence in wood and pain. Because to the Nooksack, death was not death. It was a change. Generations passed like tides, but the carvings remained. They told who the people were, what they had seen, what they had lost. They stood against time like trees that refused to fall. And then the axes came. Not the ones held by carvers, but the ones wielded by colonizers. They did not pray to the trees. They didn't wait for permission. They cut without question. Cedar was no longer sacred. It was timber. Totems were taken. Masks were sold. Canoes left to rot in fields that would become parking lots. And the mist stayed. It wrapped around stumps, curled around what was stolen. It remembered what people tried to forget. Still, in the corners of reservations and in homes pressed close by poverty, the carving continued. Quietly, one elder taught a grandson. One aunt passed down a pattern. No press, no stage, just hands, cedar and memory. The carvings became survival in the 1970s and 80s. A resurgence took hold. Nooksack artists began reclaiming their right to shape wood with meaning. Totem poles were raised again, not for tourists, but for truth. Young people learned what their parents had hidden for safety. Community centers opened workshops, old. Designs were matched with new tools, but the reverence stayed. One artist said, "When I carve, I ask the tree if it's ready. If it says no, I wait. If it says yes, I begin." That patience is culture. That listening is power today. You can walk the Nooksack lands and still see what cedar remembers. Poles watching over schoolyards, canoes gliding through fog, masks dancing once more. This isn't revival, it's continuation, because a people who carve themselves into trees cannot be erased. A spirit held in cedar cannot be silenced. So when you see the mist, don't rush through it. Slow down. Let it settle on your shoulders. Let it whisper what it knows. That there is a tribe whose story was carved, not written, whose truth was shaped in wood, not words, whose memory lives in every grain, every knot, every silent, sacred tree, dot. And in the next chapter, we drift from wood to water, from what was carved to what carried those carvings. Because every Nooksack story has a river underneath it, and every river remembers before borders, before maps, before asphalt veins cut across the land. There were the tides, and the Nooksack knew how to follow them. They didn't wander blindly. They moved with memory, muscle, and moonlight. In a time when the earth was still trusted, their canoes slid silently through the Salish Sea like prayers spoken in motion. Carved from ancient cedar and blessed with breath, these vessels were just transport daily tradition. A Nooksack didn't just take you somewhere, it brought you home. Some held entire families, others were sleek and narrow, used for swift movement between violence and weakness. All were shaped by those who understood the personality of the sea. The cedar had to be dry, but not too dry. The fire had to hollow the log evenly. Too much heat, and it cracked. Too little, and it would never sail true. They steamed the wood to bend its sides. They sang as they worked, not to pass time, but to honor it. And when the tide went out, the clams waited. Low tide was a calendar event, marked not by clocks, but by instincts passed down through generations. The elders knew when to walk barefoot into the cold flats, baskets on their backs, hands digging rhythmically. The clams weren't taken in greed, they were gathered in gratitude. A meal earned, not owed. Smoke would rise from the shorelines soon. After cedar smoke, sweet, lingering, sacred, it curled through longhouses, clung to the braids of children, drifted up to greet the mountains. the scent of survival, roasted clams, dried salmon, smoked venison. But more than that, it carried memory. The kind you can't always see, but always feel. Food wasn't just nourishment, it was ceremony. Every shell opened was a thank you. Every piece of meat, a reminder the land provides. But only if you respect the rhythm. There was no gluttony, no waste. Even the shells were returned to the earth or used in regalia and tools. Some became beads, others crushed into paint. You didn't just eat. You remembered, and then came the feasts. Potlatches. Gatherings that defied Western ideas of wealth. Here, to be rich meant to give it all away. Families would prepare for months, sometimes years, just to host a single night. Mountains of food, woven gifts, carved masks, all offered freely to neighbors and guests. Because power, to the Nooksack, wasn't what you held. It was what you shared, around fires that crackled with stories. Elders told of ancestors who transformed into orcas, who disappeared into cedar trees, who became wind when they died. Children listened, wide-eyed, their fingers sticky with salmon. Oil, every tale was a bridge, not fantasy, but history lived through metaphor. And over it all, the smoke, always the smoke. During hard winters, it was a shield. During celebration, a signal. It whispered through the trees and wrapped around canoes left upside down on the beach, as if promising you were never forgotten, even now. If you visit Lummi Island or the shores near Bellingham Bay, you might see it thin threads of cedar, smoke rising from small homes and hidden corners, reminding the land that the Nooksack are still here, still clamming, still carving, still cooking food with the same reverence their great-grandparents did. It's in the steam that rises from fresh ponds. It's in the gentle hum of paddles slicing through water. It's in the way an elder adjusts the flame under the sea. Plenty of salmon cooks slow and steady. There's nothing flashy about it. No spectacle, just survival, scented with smoke. In these acts, digging, paddling, cooking, the Nooksack preserved more than tradition. They preserved truth. The truth that no matter how many borders tried to pin them down, they always knew where to return. The beach, the tide, the cedar, the smoke, and it all starts again tomorrow. As the tide pulls out once more, the people rise. They follow the footprints left in sand and time. They ready the canoes. They carry the baskets. They breathe in the smoke and step into their story. Because to be Nooksack is to know the rhythm of the land in your bones and answer it with your hands. In the world of the Nooksack, love never needed loud promises. It was not something shouted from rooftops or sealed with gold. It was quieter than that, more sacred, a slow unfolding, like mist rising off the river at dawn, soft, deliberate, and understood by those who knew how to listen. Marriage was not a display, but a transition, a movement from one life rhythm to another. It wasn't marked by white dresses or church bells, but by cedar, salmon, and a silence full of meaning. In those times, a union began long before two people stood beside each other. It started in the eyes of elders, in the alignment of families, in the silent approval of ancestors, watching from the trees. A marriage was never just about two souls. It was about two houses, two lineages, two stories intertwining into one. Often, the proposal came not from the lovers themselves, but from their families. Respect was the foundation, not only for the one you married, but for everything they carried with them. Their name, their spirit, their past. To To love someone, you had to love where they came from, too. The gifts followed, not rings, but woven blankets, hand-carved, bowls, smoked salmon wrapped in bark. A groom's family would prepare offerings, each one a message. We see your worth. We honor your daughter. We will take care of what is most precious to you. If the bride's family accepted, the wedding was set in motion. But there was no aisle, no bouquet. Instead, there was the longhouse, dimly lit, fire crackling at its heart, the scent of cedar and fish in the air. The ceremony was not loud. It was not about performance. The bride and groom would sit quietly, surrounded by their families. Elders would speak, not in commands, but in reminders of duty, of patience, of legacy. The couple might exchange only glances, maybe a small nod, a brush of the hand, but that was enough. In that stillness, a vow lived. Afterward, there was food, always food, generous, steaming, seasoned with herbs and gratitude. The community came not to witness a show, but to welcome a bond. Children played nearby. Grandmothers passed stories as they passed plates. Love was celebrated not with champagne, but with salad and song. There were no vows written on paper. The promise was in the presence, in the showing up, in the way two people worked side by side the next morning, gathering clouds, preparing nets, building fire. Love was never separate. From labor, it lived in it. And within the home, roles weren't dictated by power. They were balanced by respect. The wife held knowledge of the family line, of medicines and dreams. The husband held knowledge of the land, of tides and carving. But both held wisdom. Both held strength. There was no bride who walked behind her. Husband, they walked together, and when there were problems, and there always are, the solution was not shouting or shaming. It was space. It was the circle of elders. It was quiet conversations around the fire, not to win, but to understand, because marriage was never expected to be perfect. It was expected to be tended to, like a canoe that needs sanding, a fire that needs feeding. Even in the rare case of separation, there was no courtroom. There were no battles for possessions. There was ceremony, a symbolic division, gifts returned, words spoken carefully, respect preserved, even in endings. And yet, many unions lasted lifetimes, not because people never argued, but because they understood love as work, and work as something worth doing together. They had watched their grandparents build entire lives out of cedar and sweat. They knew that silence was not the absence of love, but the space in which it grew. Today, the outside world has changed much of that. There are now courthouse weddings and borrowed tuxedos. The cedar smoke doesn't rise as often. The old songs are softer now, but in the quiet corners of Nooksack homes, you can still find it, that old kind of love, the kind that doesn't need to be posted, the kind that doesn't need hashtags, the kind that shows up every morning with a hot plate of food and hands ready to work. Love, to the Nooksack, was not loud, it was enduring, it was earned. Long before churches rose and towns were mapped, the trees were the tallest elders the Nooksack people knew, towering, patient, alive. The forests were not just scenery, they were memory, they were sanctuary, they were the oldest kind of truth. And in every cedar, spruce, and fir, there lived something more than bark and branch. There lived spirits, not ghosts, not monsters, but watchers, protectors, listeners. To walk beneath the trees was to enter a sacred room, a place where the air changed, where breath slowed, and where even the birds knew to sing more softly. These groves weren't just nature. They were sacred architecture, built by time, sealed by story. Children were told never to speak too loudly. In the woods, not out of fear, but out of respect. Because the trees had ears. They remembered things. They whispered them back through the rustle of needles and the creak of bows in wind. Elders spoke of tree spirits that watched over the tribe, that warned hunters of danger, that comforted feeling others. Some said that when a loved one passed on, their spirit would rest in the roots of the nearest cedar, carried upward through the trunk, becoming part of the forest canopy, always, nearby, never gone. Death in the Nooksack world wasn't the end. It was a return, a dissolving into moss, into soil, into tree rings that counted stories as much as years. There were certain groves where only the most trusted were allowed. Places so sacred they were visited only for ceremony, for healing, or to seek guidance. When everything else had failed, and there were trees no one dared cut. Not because of laws, but because of reverence. Even today, deep in Whatcom County, there are ancient trees that locals won't touch. Not out of superstition, but out of memory, because they know what their grandparents knew. Some places don't belong to us. Some places belong to the spirits. The cedar tree was more than sacred. It was the spine of Nooksack life. From its bark came rope, clothing, even medicine. Its wood became homes, canoes, masks. But each time a tree was taken, there was ritual. There were words. There was gratitude. Nothing was ever taken thoughtlessly, because nothing was just a resource. A log was never just a log. It might be a grandfather returning. It might be a spirit lending its body for a new beginning. And so, prayers were whispered, tobacco was offered, and silence was held for what had been given. Among the most powerful carvings were spirit poles, tall cedar columns carved with the faces of animals, ancestors, and mythical beings. These were not just art, they were language. They told stories to those who couldn't read ink. They warned, they remembered, they protected, the eagle meant vision, the bear meant strength, the raven, cleverness, mischief, truth. Each carving spoke a word from the old tongue. Each one connected the tribe to the spirit world, a bridge of wood between the living and the eternal, and even the wind was sacred. It moved between trees like an unseen messenger. If the wind stopped before a ceremony, it meant the spirits were watching. If it picked up suddenly during a burial, it meant a soul had crossed over. To live Nooksack was to live with the forest, not beside it. Children were taught to ask the trees for calm before speaking during important meetings. Warriors were told to touch bark before battle. Women giving birth would sleep near cedars, their scent calming both mother and child. The trees were medicine, memory, witness, and they still are, though chainsaws have scarred parts of the landscape, and roads now wind through once sacred groves. The spirit hasn't vanished. You can feel it when you walk alone under the canopy. You can hear it in the hush between breezes. You can see it in the way sunlight filters like a blessing through the leaves. Some Nooksack elders say that when you're lost, sit beneath a tree and wait. Let the wind speak. Let the roots remember you. The forest does not forget its people. In recent years, tribal members have returned to planting sacred groves, teaching children to listen again, reviving stories once nearly lost in silence. Because they know that when a people lose their trees, they lose their mirrors. And when they lose their mirrors, they forget what their faces look like before history tried to rewrite them. But the trees remember, and so the Nooksack return, not just to land, but to the spirits who dwell in it, to the ancestors who never left, to the silence that holds more wisdom than any speech. Because no matter how far modern life drags them, they know where to look. They look up. It began with the sound of paddles slicing water, not in rhythm, not in peace, but in panic. The Nooksack River, once a cradle of stories and salmon, ran dark on a morning that no one sings about. There were no drums, no welcome songs, only fleeing footsteps, rising smoke, and the bitter scent of betrayal. They came without warning, soldiers, settlers, shadows wrapped in law and musket. They came not to negotiate, but to take, to burn homes, scatter families, and redraw lines on maps they didn't understand. For centuries, the Nooksack had lived by the river's grace. Now, they were hunted by those who thought grace could be owned. And when the killing started, it wasn't just men who died. Children were dragged from mothers. Elders who once spoke with trees were silenced. Villages that had stood for generations were flattened in hours. And the river, wide-eyed and ancient, carried the blood downstream, mixing it with cedar leaves, fish bones, and the last breaths of the old world. To the white men, it was just a sweep of expansion. To the Nooksack, it was a desecration, a haunting. These were not battles fought with honor on fields. These were ambushes, massacres, the kind of history that hides behind dates and treaties but still trembles in the soil. Some of the dead were never buried. Their names live only in stories and in the silence that follows every thunderstorm. But even in retreat, the Nooksack did not vanish. They adapted, camouflaged into the landscape like the herons and moss. They spoke less in public. They prayed, more in secret, and always, they remembered. The river became both a grave and a guide at night. Survivors would dip their hands into the water and whisper to those they lost. They'd mark the trees with signs only their people knew. Symbols for safety, for mourning, for come home if you can. And as white fences rose, across their hunting grounds, they kept their identity like a glowing ember tucked deep in the chest. Years passed, then decades. But even now, when the sun hits the river just right, some say you can see the past reflected in the ripples. A canoe, drifting without a paddle. A woman's shawl caught in a branch. Red bleeding through the current, refusing to fade. The truth is, no one forgets blood in the water. No one forgets the screams of a mother as her child is taken. No one forgets the moment the old world ends, and no one knows to save it. And yet, from that rupture, something quiet began to grow. A different kind of resistance. Not one of guns or revenge, but of memory. The Nooksack started feeling what was nearly erased. Songs half remembered from the mouths of elders. Plant knowledge, whispered in corners. Basket patterns, sketched in sand. Every story saved became a form of rebellion. Every word spoken in the old language. A blade against forgetting. They began holding gatherings again. Not large, not loud, but sacred. Circles by firelight, river walks under moon, where the younger ones could learn what the textbooks refused to teach. They didn't ask for validation. They became their own historians. And still, the river flowed, a witness to pain, a bearer of legacy. They say rivers remember what the land tries to bury, and the Nooksack River remembers everything. The warmth of birth, the chill of slaughter, the hope carried in canoes long after everything else was gone. Today, the descendants, of those who bled still walk beside that water. They fish it, bless it, teach their children to respect it, because to forget the river would be to forget who they are, not victims, survivors, not relics. Revivals, this chapter, is not just about loss. It's about how people held on when everything around them fell, how they whispered to each other across time. We're still here, keep going. And as the river curves past fields now filled with roads and farms, it carries in its current the voices of those who once sang from its banks. They are not gone, they are not ghosts. They are carved into the rhythm of the water, present in the breeze that brushes cedar branches, alive in the eyes of the children who now splash where warriors once died. The Nooksack do not need statues to remember. They have the river. They have the bloodline that flows alongside it. They have stories, and those stories are rising again. The first thing to go was the lullaby. A mother once sang it to her baby as the cedar wind rocked the walls of their home, a soft rhythm made of ocean breath and old words. She didn't write it down. She didn't need to. It was passed mouth to mouth, heart to heart, like a fire kept alive in cupped hands. But somewhere between then and now, it vanished. Not all, at once, not with a bang, but quietly, like mist that slips away while you're still looking. The Nooksack language didn't die in battle, it died in silence. 1,000 tiny silences stacked on top of each other. A word forgotten here, a phrase not passed along there. A young boy told to speak English at school. A grandmother deciding not to correct him. A government form that didn't recognize the syllables of her ancestors. Little by little, the sentences grew shorter, the vowels thinned, the stories stuttered. Lechelism, the voice of the Nooksack people, once echoed through the forests, across the riverbanks. It was a language, carved from the breath of the lands, a tongue that held no word for own, but meant for share. It wasn't just how they spoke, it was how they remembered. In this language, salmon were not just fish, they were brothers. In this language, mountains had names. Time wasn't something you chased, it was something you listened to. But colonization didn't come with understanding. It came with erasure quick, sharp, and wrapped in the false kindness of education. Boarding schools punished the old tongue. Churches ignored it. Governments labeled it uncivilized. And somewhere between forced grammar books and ashamed glances, the language began to fade. Today, fewer than a dozen people speak it fluently. Most of them are elders. Their voices carry the weight of entire generations, and with every funeral, the silence grows louder. But this isn't a eulogy, because language, like land, can be stolen, but it can also be reclaimed. Some Nooksack youth are learning the language again, syllable by syllable, recording their grandparents, repeating the words like prayers. Linguists work with elders to capture every sound, every lilt, before it's too late. They've begun compiling dictionaries, creating lessons, building apps, not to archive a relic, but to awaken a voice. And when a young child sings the same lullaby his great-grandmother once did, it doesn't matter if he stumbles on a few words. What matters is that the fire is lit again. There is power in speaking. A word your oppressor never understood. There is defiance in remembering. How to say home in the language they tried to bury. And for the Nooksack, this language is more than words. It's a map back to themselves. Every verb carries a value. Every metaphor, a way of seeing the world, not in black and white, but in time and twilight. They say Lechelism speaks in circles, not straight lines. It moves like water, flowing between ideas. bending into meaning, never rushing. It's a language of patience, of relationships, of place. When you forget that language, you don't just lose vocabulary, you lose the way your people made. Sense of grief, you lose the tone they're used for. Joy, you lose the rhythm they trusted in ceremony. That's why saving the language isn't just cultural work, it's spiritual work. It's the act of memory made flesh again, across the reservation. You'll now hear old sounds in new places, in schoolrooms, on radio stations, in murals. Grandmothers correct children gently. Teachers hang phrases above the chalkboard. There's a slow, stubborn return happening, quiet as moss, steady as drum beats. But there's urgency too, because a language can't live on paper. It lives. In mouths, in jokes, in prayers said before sleep. It lives when it's heard, when it's used, when it is sung without shame. The elders know this. That's why they speak slowly, even when the young ones get frustrated. They're not just giving words, they're handing over an entire way of being. You can feel the weight of it in their pauses, in the way they look at the sky before singing. A name of a cloud that carries more meaning than English can hold them in the way they close their eyes when reciting the names of gods, as if summoning the spirits who still answer in that ancient voice. This isn't about fluency, it's whisper, about remembering. Because to speak the language again is to say, we were never broken, just buried dots. And now we are digging ourselves out, one syllable at a time. For most people, a document is just ink on a page, a signature, a form, a file buried in a cabinet. But for the Nooksack people, paper became a weapon sharper than any blade. There, wounds weren't made by swords or bullets, but by legal terms, court orders, and tribal enrollment lists. This is not the story of conquest by war. This is the quieter horror of bureaucracy. In the early 2000s, the tribe faced something almost unthinkable. They began to disappear, not from disease, not from exile, but from paperwork. More than 300 people were suddenly told they were no longer Nooksack. No blood had changed. No families had vanished. But overnight, their names were struck from the tribal rolls. Their identities, their very belonging, revoked by typed letters and cold declarations. These weren't strangers. These were mothers and grandfathers. People who had sung at funerals, danced at ceremonies, passed down the language. They had grown up in the tribe, fished the same rivers, buried their ancestors in the same ground. And now, a committee told them, you do not count. Why? Politics, power, control. Some argued it was about blood quantum, the mathematical slicing of identity. Others claimed it was a question of proof. But behind the legal talk was something much older. Fear of losing control. Fear that recognition meant sharing. And behind that fear, something even crueler. The belief that identity could be audited. This process was called disenrollment, a sterile word that hides the heartbreak inside it. Disenrollment means being cut off from tribal, healthcare, from housing, from community decisions, from your own history. Imagine being told you don't belong in the place you've always called home, that your family ties no longer matter, that your ancestors' prayers have been nullified by paperwork. That's what happened. Some received notices in the mail. Others were called into meetings. One day, you're Nooksack. The next, you're not. They cried. They screamed. Some stayed silent, stunned. Others fought back. But how do you fight a printer? How do you argue with paper that doesn't know your songs to the world outside? It sounded like a clerical issue, but inside it was a civil war. Families split, friends grew distant. The tribe tore at itself, wound by wound, name by name, and behind every document was a face. A child confused why they couldn't join the school powwow anymore. An elder wondering why their burial rites had been stripped. A mother watching. Her benefits vanish while still tending their sick son. Paper, you are taught, is flimsy, but here it carried the force of exile. Still, they didn't give up. The disenrolled members began to speak out. They filed lawsuits. They reached out to the federal government. They told their stories to anyone who would listen. They organized, not with violence, but with truth. They reminded people that being native isn't about calculations. It's about connection, and no law can erase that dot. Over time, support grew. Human rights groups stepped in. Other tribes watched closely, seeing reflections of their own fears. Because disenrollment isn't just a Nooksack issue. It's a quiet epidemic spreading across Indian country, and it's turning sacred identity into something negotiable. Eventually, the federal government stepped in. Some of the disenrollment efforts were halted. Investigations were launched. Leadership was questioned. But the damage was already done. And healing from this kind of wound, the kind you can't see on skin, takes generations. What remains is the memory of betrayal, and yet something deeper too, the reminder that identity is not given by governments. It's inherited through blood, story, and sacrifice. The disenrolled Nooksack didn't stop being Nooksack. They still spoke the language, still honored the cedar, still buried their dead in the old ways. They belonged not because someone said they did, but because their roots whispered it in every leaf, every riverstone. What does it mean to be a people? Is it a percentage, a form, or is it the rhythm? In your chest when the drum beats? That is the question the Nooksack asked. And in asking it, they exposed the fragile lie that any outsider or insider could write someone out of their own blood. Paper may cut, but the spirit bleeds deeper, and what bleeds heals. There are stories of people vanishing without a trace, but this story is harder to believe because the person didn't disappear into the woods or across the sea. They disappeared on paper, while still breathing, while still fighting to be seen. This is what it feels like to be erased while alive. Her name is still whispered in the community. A woman born Nooksack, raised Nooksack, who taught the language to children and buried her kin in cedar-lined ground. Her great-grandfather signed the census rolls. Her blood is not a question. Her identity was never in doubt, until it was. One morning, she opened a letter, a simple government envelope. Inside it, words that shattered, "You are no longer recognized." As a member of the Nooksack Indian tribe, no warning, no trial, just deletion. At first, she thought it was a mistake, a typo, a mix-up. But then the calls came. Her healthcare was denied. Her housing was revoked. Tribal access gone. Ceremonial. Rights erased. She was now a stranger on her own land. Her children cried, not understanding why they couldn't go to tribal school. Her mother passed shortly after, and the funeral rites which had been completed. Her ancestors' burial plots suddenly required tribal validation, as if grief needed a permit. Imagine your whole life written in stories. Then someone comes and crosses the mountain with a red pen. That's what happened. Not just to her, but to hundreds. She stopped being a person and started being a case file. She was told she didn't meet enrollment criteria, that her blood wasn't proven enough, that her lineage could not be verified to the necessary degree, but the truth was simpler. Politics. She had supported a faction that fell out of favor. She'd spoken up at a meeting. She had the wrong last name, or perhaps the right one, depending on who was in charge. And so she was purged, like others, in a wave of disenrollment that swept away not just people, but dignity. It's a strange pain, this kind. You are still alive. You still remember the songs, the names, the taste of clam roasted in cedar smoke. You still carry the stories, but your existence has been disqualified. Some days, she tried to pretend it was all a dream, that the paper didn't matter, that no letter could change what her heart knew. But then the phone would ring again. Another denial, another door closed, another reminder that being right didn't mean being recognized. To be erased is to become invisible, not just to institutions, but sometimes even to your own people. Neighbors avoid eye contact. Old friends grow quiet, because no one wants to be next. Fear spreads faster than fire. Still, she kept showing up, to community meetings, to ceremonies, to protests. She refused to disappear, even as the system tried to fold her into silence. One winter, she stood outside the tribal center holding a sign. I am Nooksack. You cannot vote me out of my blood. No one came to arrest her, but no one came to help either. Just passing glances, some guilty, some indifferent, some simply tired. She spoke to journalists, to legal aid, to federal agencies. She showed them her documents, her family tree, the stories passed down through generations. But again and again, she heard, it's an internal tribal matter. That phrase meant to respect sovereignty had become a shield behind which injustice could hide. She kept her voice calm, but inside she was burning. She wasn't fighting to be seen as better, only to be seen as belonging. Because in native communities, identity is survival. To be counted is to be protected. To be erased is to risk losing everything: land, language, and legacy. Years passed. Some began to be re-enrolled. Investigations exposed corruption. Policies changed. But she is still waiting, still in limbo. Her spirit, though never dimmed, if anything, the fire inside her grew. I was erased while alive, she once said. But that means I'm still here to fight. And she is. Her story is not unique. Across native nations, others have faced the same fate. People being unjust, not because they didn't belong, but because they became inconvenient. And yet, they remain. Because identity cannot be undone by signature. It is bolder than any place, deeper than any document. To be native is not a permission slip. It's a birthright, a belonging that no politics can cancel. She may not have her name on the roll, but her story is carved into the cedar, etched into river rock, woven into the songs still sung when no one is watching. She was erased on paper, but not in the heart of the land, and not in the memory of her people. Banishment once meant exile beyond the firelight into the woods, into the unknown, where spirits wandered and shame followed close behind. But in the digital age, banishment wears a new face. It doesn't come with drums or public scorn. It comes with silence. A locked login, a revoked access code, a name quietly deleted from a spreadsheet. For the Nooksack, this silence cuts louder. Then a war cry. It begins with a notification, an email, a text. Sometimes no warning at all. Suddenly, your healthcare vanishes. Your phone calls aren't returned. Your elders' names vanish from tribal records. You show up for a meeting, and the door doesn't open. You've been banished, not by decree, but by deletion in 2016. Dozens of Nooksack families were forcibly disenrolled, targeted for political reasons. The tribal government called it house cleaning, but those who lived through it called it something else: erasure. This wasn't just about bloodlines or membership. This was about control. They called it paper genocide. But in a world run by data and screens, it felt like digital death. Social media became a battleground. People posted screenshots of revoked ID cards, of eviction notices from tribal housing. Others were blocked, unfriended, muted. The very platforms that once brought native youth together now became tools of exile. To be banished in the past meant losing land. Today, it means losing identity in databases, in government registries, in the eyes of a digital world that only believes what it can verify online. They were removed from healthcare roles, cut off from food stipends, denied school enrollment, even denied the right to attend funerals held on tribal property. Some fought back with lawsuits, others with songs. One grandmother live-streamed her eviction, tears in her voice, a cedar basket clutched in her lap. She said, "They took my house, but they will not take who I am." This new kind of banishment doesn't end at the reservation border. It follows you in your phone, in your inbox, in the invisible code that now decides who is native and who is not. And yet, the response wasn't just grief, it was adaptation. Disenrolled families created digital memory banks. They uploaded tribal songs to cloud drives, recorded elder stories to keep safe from vanishing. They met on Zoom, held ceremonies on Facebook groups, shared dreams and passions, vanished in galaxies, but never in the hearts of each other. The Nooksack diaspora learned how to keep the fire alive without wood or flame. In digital exile, they built from scratch. Children taught YouTube, other language through maps. Grandfathers told stories by voice notes. Young women held online vigils with candle emojis and stories typed in all caps. They redefined what it meant to be together, because a people can be banned from buildings, but not from being. And in every comment, every message, every video, they carved a deeper truth, that identity isn't granted, it's remembered. The Nooksack story is not about helplessness. It's about a refusal to vanish, even as passwords were changed and names were crossed out. Their presence surged on websites, in interviews, on advocacy platforms. They became digital warriors, logging on not for attention, but for survival. Some tribes stood in solidarity, others remained silent. Sovereignty, after all, is a sacred shield. But when that shield is turned inward, when it is used to wound, who steps forward? For the disenrolled, justice still feels far away. But visibility is a weapon, and memory is resistance. In this age of clouds and clicks, the Nooksack have proven something profound. That community is not confined to soil. It breathes in signals, and scrolls, and shared stories. That even banishment can be undone, not with permission, but with persistence. The grandmother who once live-streamed her loss. Her video has been seen by hundreds of thousands. Her voice echoed further than any council chamber ever could. She says she's still waiting to return, but in the meantime, she's teaching her grandkids how to pray in the old language. She records them, uploads them, tags them with pride. They can remove my name from their files, she says, but they will never remove it from the mouths of my children. And And so, the Nooksack moved forward, not erased, but rewritten, not banished, but reborn through code and courage. They said the songs would die, that the drums would stop, the words would fade, the voices would forget how to rise. They said there wouldn't be enough left of the Nooksack to make a sound worth hearing. They were wrong. It began with whispers, soft hums, beneath cedar trees, half-remembered chants sung in kitchens, while water-boiled lullabies threaded into bedtime by grandmothers who hadn't forgotten what survival felt like. The children listened. At first, they didn't understand the words, but they understood the feeling, and feelings last longer than memory. These weren't just songs, they were stories carried on the wind, maps without ink, prayers stitched into rhythm, and somewhere between the beat of the drum and the breath of the forest, the children started to hum along at school. They sat quietly while history books skipped over their tribe. But at home, their feet tapped ancient tempos on kitchen floors. In backyards, they traced patterns in the soil like their ancestors had once carved. In their hands, iPhones, in their ears, sacred songs passed through generations, voice alone. Elders once feared the silence more than the government. They worried the next generation would not care, that the pressure to blend in would erase every syllable of their culture. But they didn't know the fierce curiosity of children. They didn't know that these little ones, with their earbuds and questions and hunger for truth, would find a way to listen through the noise. Some found old recordings in dusty boxes. Others watched grainy footage of tribal dances from decades ago. But most of them learned the songs the same way they always had, by watching the faces of their grandparents, by sitting in circles, fingers drumming on knees, voices unsure but willing. One boy heard his great-grandmother sing during a storm and asked what it meant. She smiled and said, "It's a song for the rain to remember who we are." Another girl recorded her grandfather's chant on her phone and played it at school for her friends. One of them asked, "Is that you singing?" And she said proudly, "It's who I came from." The melody didn't fade. It shifted. It adapted, just as the Nooksack always had. Now, you'll hear it in classrooms where language classes are held, not in lectures, but in rhythm. Teachers with tattoos of salmon bones guiding young hands to clap in time. Songs taught not as music, but as medicine. The children didn't just remember the songs, they made them louder at community events. Their voices lead the first verse. At protests, they bring drums. At funerals, they raise songs so the ancestors can find a soul and guide it home. And even those who've never set foot on ancestral land. Urban kids raised in cities far from the rivers and fog find themselves learning Nooksack words through apps, through group chats, through YouTube videos made by cousins they've never met. Because a song, once remembered, can travel faster than any eraser. One teenager said, "I didn't feel Nooksack until I learned the morning song. Then I didn't feel like anything else." These aren't just cultural artifacts. They're living blueprints of identity. They sing about salmon and cedar, about birth and burial, about the moon watching the tide. Some songs don't even have words, just tones that mimic wind through moss or water slipping over rocks. Sounds that aren't written but known. The children don't ask why the songs matter. They feel it, in the way people stand when they hear the drum, in the hush that falls over the room before the first note, in the tears that follow without warning, from elders who thought they'd never hear these songs again, not in full voice, not from someone so young. One elder said, "It's not that we taught them, It's that they remembered before we even finished. That's the magic of memory wrapped in melody. It waits in the marrow, in the blood. All it needs is breath. And so they breathe. And so they sing. The children are not just the future of the tribe. They are the chorus of its survival. Loud, soft, sacred, steady. Voices rising in unison to declare what cannot be silenced. The world does not listen, but the trees do. The rivers do. The ancestors certainly do. And when the night falls, and the fires flicker, and someone young lifts their chin and sings in the dark, the tribe is not gone, it is growing. They tried to flatten the people into paperwork, to compress centuries into a checklist, twofold families into folders, and turn ancestors into barcodes. That's how the system worked, or rather, didn't dot to the US government. The Nooksack were digits on a spreadsheet, boxes to be ticked, files to be approved, or denied. If your name didn't appear on the right roll, if your blood quantum didn't meet a sliding standard, you didn't just lose services, you lost identity. But the Nooksack are not. Paperwork, they are not bound by ink or digital code. They are not archives. They are living breath, carved cedar, and bloodlines that stretch further than any document can trace. Still, the files came. Starting in the mid-20th century, federal policy became a tangle of bureaucracy, demanding proof of who was truly native. Tribal enrollment became less about connection and more about compliance. Tribal councils, often under federal pressure, were forced to validate members like banks validating loans. And somewhere between the numbers and the signatures, something deeply human got lost. Imagine being told you're no longer Nooksacked, not by your family, not by your culture, but by a piece of mail. A form, a letter with your name at the top and a silent void at the bottom. That's what happened. Over 300 people, many with generations of Nooksack heritage, were disenrolled, stripped not just of benefits, but of belonging. The official reason? Insufficient documentation. But behind that phrase were stories of hurt, of betrayal, of people suddenly treated as strangers in their own tribe. One woman said it felt like being orphaned, while her parents were still alive. Others stopped attending tribal events, fearing the stares, the silence, the erasure in real time. The trauma wasn't just cultural, it was spiritual. It told people they no longer existed in the eyes of their own. And yet, even amid the cold cruelty of administrative denial, the warmth of identity refused to die. Because identity isn't a folder in an office. It's the way a grandmother hums while cooking clams. It's the way cedar smoke curls when a child is named. It's in the river rituals and winter feasts. In the language whispered to babies and shouted in protest. To be Nooksack is not to be verified by an algorithm. It is to carry memory in the bones. Some fought back. Legal battles emerged. Community protests. Interviews with media outlets. What began as quiet pain turned into loud defiance. The disenrolled spoke, not just for themselves, but for every native person told they weren't native enough. How can someone else decide what runs in the blood? One man asked, voice shaking. Others wrote letters, stood outside councils, formed networks across reservations. And in doing so, they exposed a deeper wound in Native America, the tension between self-determination and federal oversight, between inclusion and exclusion, between tradition and paperwork. Because the truth is, enrollment disputes are not just political. They are deeply personal. They divide cousins. They silence elders. They make children question whether they belong, and no community survives long when it cuts its own branches. The Nooksack have begun to reckon with this. New conversations are emerging. Some are hard, some are healing, because the future cannot be built on documents alone. It must be rooted in recognition, in stories, in the sacred act of saying to someone, yes, you are one of us. This chapter is not just about disenrollment, it's about reclaiming humanity from the jaws of systems too rigid to hold it. It's about people standing tall even when their names are crossed off lists. It's about a tribe asking not what do the papers say, but who remembers your song. Today, some of those who were erased are still fighting to return, not just to the benefits, but to the drum circle, to the naming ceremony, to the place in the story that should never have been stolen. And others, those who remain, are learning to listen, to ask what unity really means, to ask how a tribe survives if it forgets its own. Because a person is not a number, not a file. They are a fire lit in childhood and kept alive through every trial. They are scars and songs in sacred lands walked by barefoot ancestors. They are cedar dust and ocean wind. They are laughter under starlight and morning at sunrise. They are here, still, always, and the paper never defined them. It never could. There are fires that roar, that consume forests, tear through homes, and leave the land scorched. And then there are the quiet ones, the embers that hide under ash, whispering warmth in the cold, waiting for someone to breathe life into them again. The Nooksack fire never went out. It just burned differently. For generations, their world was wrapped in cedar and shadow. Their wisdom came not from books, but from wind. Their survival wasn't written in laws, but in the way they moved with the land. And though that world was shaken by colonization, by exile, by silence, the spirit behind it flickered on. You can still see it in a child threading salmon bones between fingers, learning the old ways from a grandfather who remembers what the census forgot, in a teenager who speaks the Nooksack language into a microphone, recording words that nearly vanished, in the bent back of an elder stirring sacred soup over a flame that dances. In rhythm of memory, this is not nostalgia, this is resistance. Because for a tribe, once nearly erased from paper, presence itself is rebellion. Singing the old songs is protest. Carving canoes is defiance. Every word remembered, every name passed down, every feast prepared in hands shaped by loss. All of it was the fire that still flickers. When you walk amongst the forest in the morning, you can feel it. The ancestors never left. They lean on the trees. They whisper along them. Rivers, they settle in fog, and they watch, not for apologies, but for continuation. They want the story told, properly, fully, with both pain and pride. The story of a people who were nearly made invisible, but instead became undeniable. There's a healing now, slow and uneven. The tribe is rebuilding, not just buildings, but bonds. Council rooms once divided by silence now carry voices asking, what next? Elders and youth meet in circles, not just to mourn, but to imagine. Some are relearning words there. Great-grandparents spoke fluently. Others are planting the first cedar of a new canoe. And still others, once pushed out, once disenrolled, are knocking on doors and asking to be seen again. The process isn't easy. Identity isn't a straight path. It's a fire walk, but the Nooksack know how to walk fire. They've done it before. They did it when smallpox tore through the valleys. when missionaries tried to rewire their prayers, when maps forgot their villages and textbooks never spoke their name. They lit their own path then, they're lighting it now, and with every generation that rises, the flame grows steadier. Not long ago, it looked like the end. The language nearly lost, the ceremonies disrupted. The young pulled towards screens instead of stories. But something beautiful is happening now. A return, not to the past, but to the source, the essence, the ember. They're not trying to become what they were. They're becoming who they are, shaped by both heritage and hardship. The sacred dances now move beside basketball games. Traditional songs play between Spotify tracks. Healing ceremonies are live-streamed, yes, but the medicine is still real. The future isn't about purity. It's about presence, and the fire that still flickers burns brighter with every child who chooses to learn. What was once whispered in kitchens is now spoken into classrooms. What was nearly forgotten is now inked into tattoos, painted into murals, etched into digital archives. And it's not just for memory's sake. It's for survival, because a people cannot live by history alone. They must burn forward. The Nooksack are doing just that. They carry their fire in baskets, in drums, in the curved spine of a canoe. They carry it in lullabies, in laughter, in the silence before prayer. They carry it in the refusal to disappear. They are not broken, they are burning. And even though the world changes fast, even though tribes still face legal fights, climate threats, and cultural erasure, this tribe, carved from cedar and mist, still holds its light. It may not look like it once did. The villages may be gone, the forests thinner, the rivers louder with machines. But if you stand still long enough on the banks of the Nooksack River, as the morning fog pulls back and the herons rise, you will feel it, that soft heat underfoot, that silent flame in the marrow of the land, that story still being told, not with bitterness, but with breath. Because this isn't a story about endings, it's about flickers, about how even in the darkest winters, some fires never go out. You just have to lean close enough and listen.